In a quiet town where power, pride, and revenge rule the streets, a secretive group known as the Black Lady Gang is about to ignite chaos no one saw coming. When betrayal meets desperation behind the cold bars of a jail cell, the line between justice and survival blurs. This is the Black Lady Gang Break the Jail Bar, Stop Them, Otherwise I Will Shoot You.
Chapter 1. The internet caught fire at 2:17 a.m. local time, not with a polished press release or a carefully staged confrontation, but with a single shaky phone video that threaded itself through the usual veins of virality. Group chat forwards, angry comments, and a dozen reaction channels that specialize in outraged exposition. The clip was short, grainy, and perfectly consumable. 4 black-clad figures slipping through the warped iron bars of a municipal lockup side yard, the camera jittering on a hooded shoulder, breath visible in the cold night. The title that accompanied the reposts was blunt and gleeful. The Black Lady Gang Break the Jail Bar. Stop them, otherwise I will shoot you. The punctuation and the amateur tone made it taste like an overnight conspiracy, a public scandal stitched from snippets and speculation. By dawn, the snippet had become a dossier. Comment sections bloomed into detective forums. Screenshots of adjacent security cameras uploaded by concerned residents showed the same silhouettes moving against sodium vapor streetlights. A mistaken street name was corrected, then corrected again. A local influencer with a reputation for exposing neighborhood scandals posted timestamps and a shaky diagram of the prison yard. The channel subscriber count ticked upward in real time. And with each upward tick, the story mutated, gained angles, and accrued villains. The Black Lady Gang label guided the story toward tropes, mystery, menace, and moral panic. Fingers pointed at everything and nothing: a coordinated jailbreak, a political demonstration, an elaborate prank, or in the most optimistic thread, a community organizing a protest for a wrongfully convicted neighbor. Underneath the howls of condemnation and the pleas for calm, an undercurrent hummed. This was content, and content meant momentum. Algorithms rewarded certainty. Viewers craved drama. Creators built narratives that folded in the loudest, angriest parts of the comments until those parts read like evidence. In the first official press release, the local sheriff's office confirmed the security breach at an auxiliary holding facility. The language was measured, legalistic, and strategic. Meanwhile, the town's social fabric frayed in small, visible ways. Local businesses taped no filming signs in windows. Neighborhood watch WhatsApp groups proliferated warnings. Families who owned rental properties inspected locks as if performance could substitute for truth. The municipal meeting scheduled for later that week to discuss budgets and public safety would now have an additional, volatile agenda. Citizens who had once watched such meetings with the practiced disinterest of those who knew the system's sluggishness were suddenly rehearsing talking points meant to be read into microphones and recorded for channels that specialized in caught-on-camera justice. At the center of the cyclone were 4 women, if the video was to be believed, whose existence was more rumor than person. The Black Lady Gang became a banner under which multiple identities converged: the wronged, the dangerous, the liberated, the criminal. Media ecosystems love archetypes. They allow complexity to be boxed and sold. For viewers who demanded a heroine, the gang could be written as a Robin Hood figure, freeing someone unjustly shackled. For viewers who needed a villain, they were opportunists, exploiting a porous system. Neither simple version satisfied the people who had skin in the game, and yet both were useful for creators whose livelihoods depended on outrage. There were other, quieter stories unfolding in parallel. A corrections officer on leave from the facility spent the night in a Denny's booth, replaying the looped footage on a cracked phone and tracing the silhouettes with a thumbnail. A municipal clerk started compiling a list of all inmates who had been housed at the auxiliary facility over the past month, scanning names for anything that might explain a motive. An elderly woman whose grandson had been briefly detained several months prior posted a lopsided letter to the town's forum that demanded accountability and care, not spectacle. Their voices were drowned beneath the fray of influencers and theorists, but they existed as reminders that for some, the event was not a narrative to be consumed, but a fragmentation of real lives.
As the day moved toward evening, the tone of the channels shifted from accusation to advice. Videos titled, "What to Do If the Black Lady Gang Comes to Your Neighborhood," saturated feeds. They were practical in the same way urban legends are practical. Fill in your details, secure your doors, document suspicious activity, and call the number. Embedded in these videos was a social lesson. Surveillance had become a civic ritual. Cameras multiplied like indifferent witnesses. Each lens was an invitation to vigilance and voyeurism. The idea that the community could be the keeping force against crime was comforting in its simplicity. The reality of an online-fueled moral panic was messier. Nuance didn't grab as many views. By the first night after the video surfaced, the jail yard was cordoned. The sheriff's office posted a blurred, ongoing investigation notice on social media, and a spokesperson whose name was repeated in every livestream promised updates. False leads bloomed like mold. A local woman in a black coat was detained by officers after a neighbor insisted she matched the video silhouette. She was released after an hour with an apology, but the apology was eclipsed by reactionary clips framing the detention as proof of either incompetence or cover-up. The machinery of proof and suspicion was clanking, and the public watched for the next gear to catch. The story was getting bigger than any single frame. It wanted faces and motives. It wanted to explain a threat that read like clickbait into concrete act. And while the town waited for official answers, the rumor that someone had scrawled "Stop them, otherwise I will shoot you" across a drainage culvert became the sort of detail that demanded to be true because it matched the tone of the conversation. Whether written in anger, fear, or for clicks, the line threaded through the town like a warning and a challenge. Chapter 2. The morning after the video shredded the town's sleep, the local news program opened with a 2-minute block of faces, residents, commentators, and one expensive-looking attorney who had flown in from the city. Each segment was trimmed to a neat soundbite, a snapshot of moral positioning. Online, the narrative pressure changed shape. Viewers demanded answers, and those with the best microphones supplied certainty. In the vacuum between official statements and community curiosity, content creators curated a mythology. The sheriff's office released still frames from surveillance footage and a statement that read like a carefully edited contract. They would not speculate. They would not release identities. They would follow protocol. For those tired of protocol, the silence was a provocation. Channels that specialized in naming and shaming posted side-by-side comparisons of the frames and footage, overlaying annotations with dramatic fonts and earnest, moralizing music. The comments were an echo chamber where outrage fossilized into narrative, a behavior pattern that fed back into the algorithm and told creators that heat equaled clicks. Within 48 hours, a leak surfaced, an unredacted list of the holding facility's detainees that had made the rounds on a private messaging board. The list was messy and incomplete, but it offered the sort of detail the public craved: names, intake dates, and charges. An online sleuth claimed on a viral thread to have matched one name to a social media profile with posts about unjust incarceration and community activism. The thread gained traction, and with traction came a new certainty that the gang's motive was political. But certainty in the age of virality was a fragile thing, susceptible to being toppled.
In a public library's modest meeting room, an informal panel convened. A retired corrections officer, a civil rights advocate, a social worker, and a young content creator whose channel specialized in exposing local corruption. Each of them had perspectives that cut across the town's polarized feeds. The content creator argued that virality could be a tool for justice, that exposure forced institutions to answer. The civil rights advocate countered that exposure without context was a cruelty, that channels prioritize spectacle over systemic fixes. The retired officer talked about perimeter checks and timing. They all agreed on one point. The footage had become its own kind of trial, and humans were poor at nuanced deliberation when their attention was monetized. Amid the debate and the noise, concrete steps were taken. The sheriff's office installed temporary motion sensor lights and updated locks on the auxiliary facility. They released a basic timeline of events and a note asking anyone with further footage to come forward. The sheriff emphasized collaboration with the state police and forensic teams, invoking the language of thoroughness that, in truth, did not always comfort those who demanded immediate accountability. On the underside of the mainstream narrative, the story had private ramifications. Families of those once detained at the facility received hostile messages and were doxxed in drifts of digital malice. Small victims of mistaken identity were thrust into firestorms that consumed their privacy. A teenage influencer who had once live-streamed a protest in front of the jail found her comment section filled with people accusing her of being an apologist for the gang because of a blurry throwback photo in the corner of a feed. She posted a short, tightly edited video denying involvement and urging calm. Still, the damage was done. Trust, once frayed, is hard to restore. As the week progressed, the town's moral panic morphed into a more organized theater. A private security firm offered neighborhood protection assessments and sold out a webinar that promised to explain how to keep your property safe from the next break-in. A local pastor put up a sign outside his church that read, "Pray for peace, not panic." All of these responses fed the narrative that the town had to do something visible, because visible action was the currency of legitimacy in a climate where perception often replaced policy. In the darker corners of message boards, speculation bloomed into plans. Threats were amplified by anonymity. Some posts a late-night opinion column captured the town's contradictions succinctly. Everyone wanted security, but also craved an explanation that fit their biases. The columnists argued that the viral clip had acted as a mirror, reflecting the anxieties and resentments that had already been fermenting. The jail's broken bar was not merely metal, it was a symbol. Whether the breakage had been planned as liberation, vandalism, or staged content, its meaning was malleable, shaped by the hands and channels that shared it. And in that malleability lay danger. Stories that could be shaped into justifications for violence, for vigilantism, for quick moral judgments. As evening spread across town and screens lit in kitchen windows, the municipality prepared for another public meeting. The agenda would include a review of the incident, comments from concerned citizens, and a closed session for discussing law enforcement measures. But the meeting would also be recorded, streamed, and turned into dozens of videos, each with its own angle, each with its own audience. If the first chapter had been an ignition, the second felt like the spread of embers. The town waited for a spark, unsure whether it would lead to illumination or a conflagration. Chapter 3. The public meeting was a study in performative civics. Chairs lined the community center in the geometrical precision of democracy's theater. The live stream attracted an audience larger than the room could hold. Video reactions multiplied across platforms. There were quick edits with furious titles, slow burn analyses that promised to reveal what really happened, and stylized countdowns that teased the most dramatic moments. The town's energy had coalesced into a single, uneasy focus. Everyone who attended or watched felt they were participating in a civic event that had the weight of history, though the history in question was unfolding at an uneasy speed. The sheriff's representative presented a timeline again, this time with more images and less language. The presentation made the incident feel like a technical failure, a latch left undone, a fence unbolted, a patrol misaligned. For those on the receiving end of the narrative, this was insufficient. People wanted accountability, not procedural diagrams. They wanted names and motives. They wanted the comforting simplicity of a culprit to go with their outrage. The public demanded visible consequences, and when institutions could not immediately supply them, the void filled with speculation. Outside, a small group gathered with signs. Some called for investigation into the facility's management, others warned against mob justice. A handful held up mock placards that repeated the viral threat, some using it as satire, others as warning. Reporters circled the groups like cartographers of conflict, and every face with a sign found its way into a clip that would be trimmed into a headline. The platforms loved those moments: community engagement, a sense of stakes, and the whiplash of contradictory positions. 2 days into the meeting's fallout, a popular channel specializing in property drama posted an investigative-style video claiming to have matched the silhouettes to a local activist group. The video was edited with rapid cuts and heavy captions, constructing an airtight narrative with the selective generosity of motivated editing. The activist group's social media presence, however, showed a different story. rallies, community kitchens, and advocacy for prisoners' rights. The activists had their own set of grievances: overcrowding, procedural neglect, and a history of small but significant administrative lapses. For them, the jail breach, if it had been a breach, might have been intended as a protest, not a robbery. When activism meets sensationalism online, the friction often yields collateral.
The town's economy felt the microshock of the scandal. Real estate agents found their open house videos shadowed by chatter about safety. Parents canceled planned neighborhood block parties. Even the coffee shop across from the municipal building scrambled to manage the crowd of live streamers who treated the spot as a scenic vantage point. Small businesses tried to adapt, posting their hours and safety measures on social media like armor. The virus of attention did what viruses do best. It replicated, occupying new hosts and leaving trauma in its wake. A whistleblower from within the corrections facility reached out to a journalist through encrypted means and claimed certain maintenance requests had been ignored due to budget cuts. The journalist, careful and methodical, verified parts of the claim and published a long-form piece that filled in some institutional context: understaffing, deferred maintenance, and the bureaucratic pattern of patches rather than reforms. The piece did not exonerate any alleged actors in the video, but it shifted public discourse by broadening the narrative to include systemic failure. For the first time since the clip went viral, some conversations moved away from individual guilt and toward institutional responsibility. Yet the clip's human center, the four figures, remained an absence. No one had identified them with certainty. In the void, identity was synthesizable. Online impersonations and misattributions turned unclear faces into icons. A woman inadvertently matched by an influencer's grainy side-by-side became a target for harassment. An elderly neighbor testified that she had once seen young women in black passing through the area months before, but her testimony.
The town's leader called for a town hall where evidence would be presented and explained. Citizens prepared questions that had been polished in comment sections and group chats. The hall filled with expectant faces, and the livestream's chat exploded with predictions. The meeting that was meant to calm the town's nerves instead became the site of another performance, one where governance attempted to compete with the speed of modern outrage. It became clear that transparency alone would not pacify a population whose primary interaction with the event had been through curated clips and edited narratives. Trust, it turned out, was not a thing that could be restored with a slideshow. In the quiet between the staged statements and the live-streamed indignation, ordinary life continued to thread through the scandal. A teacher adjusted lesson plans to address students' anxieties about safety. A small group of volunteers organized a neighborhood watch program, focusing on community support rather than confrontation. They trained themselves to document responsibly, to prioritize non-escalation, and to engage law enforcement with restraint. It was a modest effort, perhaps insufficient in scale to alter the direction of virality, but it represented the kind of societal work that tries to exist beneath the roaring spectacle. The narrative's third act closed with no arrests and a deepening sense of ambiguity. The footage had become an axis around which a town's fears and hopes spun. Questions remained unresolved. Who were the figures? What was their motive? And what did the threat really mean in a town that had suddenly learned to live its civic life through screens? The next chapter promised either clarification or further displacement, because in a culture that rewards urgency, ambiguity tends to be filled, often by the loudest, not the truest.
Chapter 4. Weeks after the initial clip broke the internet, the town settled into a tense equilibrium. Daily life rhymed with the scandal, punctuated by updates, leaks, and the occasional unrelated viral distraction. The sheriff's office continued to release incremental findings, technical reports about camera angles, a log of repair requests, and a list of potential witnesses. The public digested each installment the way an audience consumes serialized drama. Eagerly, skeptically, and always hungry for the next twist. Interest shifted toward motive. Journalists and content creators dug into the social fabric surrounding the auxiliary facility. Community activists, disaffected youth, former detainees, and contractors who had worked on the building. Each profile was edited and captioned to fit existing narratives. People who had once been obscure were now subject to the apparatus of scrutiny. A mechanic who had once repaired the facility's doors found his name in a compiled thread because of a comment he had made 6 months earlier about budget constraints. The phenomenon was familiar, a digital seance where every traceable action could be summoned as evidence. In the midst of this, a confidential tip reached a reputable newsroom. A transfer log had been altered. According to the whistleblower, someone had backdated an entry to cover an unrecorded movement of a detainee. The newsroom treated the claim cautiously, verifying records and cross-checking shifts. When they published their findings, the town reacted with renewed fervor. If true, the alterations suggested either gross negligence or a deliberate attempt to disguise motions inside the facility. The revelation did not resolve the viral clip's mystery, but it reframed the discussion toward accountability within institutional walls. Concurrently, a coalition of neighborhood groups organized an open-source mapping project to catalog the town's publicly available footage, doorbell cameras, street cams, and business feeds. The project was pitched as a civic resource, designed to aid investigations and provide an archive. Volunteers combed through hours of footage, annotating timestamps and cross-referencing angles. The project's terminologies, geolocation, metadata, chain of custody, filtered into local conversation. For some, it felt empowering, ordinary residents pulling resources for clarity. For others, it felt invasive, communities policing themselves in ways that might replace formal investigations or enable harassment. The phrase that had metastasized through the community, "Stop them, otherwise I will shoot you," continued to flap at the heart of the town's dialogue. A civic psychologist wrote an op-ed analyzing how threats, real or implicit, functioned as a social weapon. They rally by fear, coerce compliance, and sometimes provoke the very violence they promised to prevent. The column was widely read and sparking nuanced comments, but nuance is not viral in the way outrage is. The line continued to be used in outbursts, in threat-filled messages, and as a parody on late-night feeds. It existed now as both symptom and catalyst. At the local correctional facility, pressure mounted. The warden, long accustomed to the steady rhythms of administration, found herself under the glare of public scrutiny. She navigated media requests with the careful precision of someone who understood the legal stakes. Staff morale faltered. Officers, already underpaid and overworked, now fielded pointed questioning from their own community. A few of them took voluntary time off to escape the glare. The institution that had been an unremarkable handle on bureaucracy was suddenly a character in a drama that everyone watched with a kind of disorienting intimacy. Meanwhile, in a small apartment cluttered with camera equipment, a mid-tier content creator edited together a speculative timeline that claimed to show the gang's planning stages. The video made leaps, reasonable in the creator's mind, reckless to others, and it patterned a narrative of premeditation that many viewers accepted. The creator's account ballooned with subscribers, and with subscribers came the pressure to produce more definitive content. The incentives for certainty intensified the risk of misattribution. The town, watching the clip of the clip, became further removed from primary evidence. Intermediaries supplied the context, fashioned it into a neat arc, and sent it back out for consumption. As the public consumed interpretations and counter-interpretations, private reconciliation took place. A former detainee whose name had circulated as possibly connected to the video wrote a long post about the experience of being assumed guilty by association. He recounted night in the holding cell, the indignities of miscommunication, and the social toll of being mentioned in rumor. The post was deeply human, a narrative of harm without the spectacle. It did not get as many views as the edited timelines, but those who read it found themselves humanized in ways the trending content rarely allowed. Legal maneuvers began to shape the public story. Attorneys filed suit against a few channels for defamation on behalf of individuals who had been wrongly accused in viral posts. The suits were carefully worded, aiming to make a point. Online shaming had consequences, and there were lines creators could cross that would not be protected by the cloak of virality. The defendants argued free speech and editorial freedom. The plaintiffs argued responsibility.
The lawsuits were slow-moving but significant. The law, when applied to new forms of harm, can be a brake on the machinery of rumor. Amid the courtroom rhetoric and forensic examinations, a quieter development offered a thread of human intention. A woman who had long worked with families affected by incarceration organized an improvised restorative circle. She invited incarcerated individuals, family members, officers, and advocates to sit across from one another and speak about harm and remediation. The sessions were raw, unedited, and unfit for glossy timelines. They produced no certainties about the viral clip, but they reframed the conversation around repair rather than retribution. Participants who attended reported feeling exposed and exhausted, but also heard in ways that the online maelstrom did not allow. Then a breakthrough occurred, not in the form of a big reveal, but as a technical detail. Forensic analysts noticed discrepancies in the original viral clip's audio track. Background noise patterns did not match the recorded timestamps. Some ambient sounds were missing, as if the clip had been recompressed or edited. The discovery suggested manipulation of the file, though it did not by itself explain the motive or origin. The new focus on the clip's authenticity shed some doubt on every confident assertion that had multiplied in its wake. Those who had built careers on certainty found themselves contending with the possibility that they had been constructing edifices atop sand. The shifting tide of evidence had a disorienting effect. Some viewers, previously convinced of a single storyline, pivoted to skepticism. Others doubled down, cherry-picking fragments to affirm pre-existing beliefs. The town's debates splintered further, with factions forming around notions of authenticity, responsibility, and the moral hazards of mediated outrage. The community center that had once hosted a crowded meeting now found itself a venue for smaller discussions: ethics in journalism, responsible content creation, and the limits of public shaming.
Chapter 5. By the time official reports reached the public, the scandal had been through 3 phases: spectacle, speculation, and scrutiny. The state's independent review board released a dense, heavily footnoted document that cataloged procedural shortcomings, ambiguous footage, and possible signs of edited media. The report did not provide neat answers, but it did name patterns: deferred maintenance, poor documentation practices, and gaps in surveillance integrity. For a town that had demanded certainty, the report read like a moral and technical inventory, necessary but insufficient to satisfy the appetite for clarity. The press digested the report in different ways. Local channels presented executive summaries with hot takes and call-in segments. National outlets used the story as an example of the modern phenomenon where virality drives agenda more than evidence does. The social media landscape populated itself with short-form reactions, 40-second rants, 15-second reckonings, each compressing complexity into emotionally compelling précis. The compression did not make the underlying issues go away, it merely reframed them for circulation. Around this time, a photograph circulated showing a faint chalk outline on the jail's interior pavement. The outline was accompanied by a caption claiming it marked where a detainee had been held during the night of the breach. The image was compelling because of its forensic aesthetic. It looked like an artifact from an investigation. Analysts were quick to note that chalk marks degrade in hours, and that the photograph alone could not prove anything. Still, the image was shared widely and became another piece that people folded into their mental jigsaws. Within activist circles, the conversation matured. Those who had initially seen the viral clip as an act of protest began to articulate a set of demands: improved oversight, transparent maintenance logs, and a public committee to monitor complaints about detention facilities. The movement organized petitions and town hall petitions that transcended the immediate scandal. The viral moment had ignited public scrutiny, but whether it would translate into sustained reform remained an open question. Legal battles churned. Defamation suits filed by individuals falsely accused in viral posts began to move forward. The hearings forced creators to defend their editorial decisions, and in some cases, to produce the raw footage they had used in their edits. A few channels, facing legal pressure and potential financial liability, issued apologies and retractions. The tumult prompted wider conversations about platform responsibility, the degree to which social sites should police content, and the cost of allowing incendiary videos to spread unchecked. As the town wrestled with institutional questions, individual people tried to reclaim their stories from the maelstrom. The woman wrongfully detained after being misidentified in the video posted a longer account about her fear, shame, and the way the town's social media exposed her family to harassment. Her narrative moved some, but was drowned in continuing updates about potential perpetrators and new leaks. The asymmetry between those who could issue well-produced videos and those whose lives were upended by those same videos remained stark.
There were, paradoxically, moments of solidarity. A coalition of small businesses hosted a neighborhood reset, a weekend of free legal clinics, safety workshops, and community art projects that invited residents to express their experiences through murals and spoken word performances. The event sought to reorient the town away from spectacle and toward repair. Artists painted a wall with a mural featuring 4 abstract figures behind an open, broken bar, an ambiguous depiction that recognized both the viral clip and the town's complicated response. The mural drew curious visitors and eventually drew more nuanced conversation than the trending videos. Media literacy groups took the scandal as a teachable moment. Workshops sprouted up in libraries and schools, teaching residents how to verify information, understand metadata, and contextualize sources. Students learned to question the difference between inference and evidence. The workshops did not halt the spread of sensational content, but they generated a modest cohort of citizens better equipped to spot manipulation. In a town that had been quick to weaponize footage, these educational efforts were a small but meaningful counterweight. Behind the scenes, investigators pursued forensic leads. An analysis of camera placements and lines of sight discovered that a crucial angle had been obscured by an overgrown tree, an oversight that explained some of the ambiguities in the footage. Further technical review suggested that some of the viral clip's audio had been stripped, a finding consistent with earlier analysis and which complicated claims about the clip's authenticity. The investigators' work was meticulous and unglamorous. It lacked the immediacy of a viral edit, but it mattered to the administration of truth. In the margins of the town's attention, a peculiar coalition formed. A retired corrections officer and a young documentary filmmaker discovered shared interests. The officer, tired of the simplifications, wanted to protect the integrity of the system he had served. The filmmaker wanted to tell the fuller story of the people at the facility, staff and detainees alike. They collaborated on a short piece that humanized the institution's everyday workers, their struggles with budgets, and their moral conflicts. The film's quiet, empathetic tone contrasted sharply with the sensational videos that had consumed the town. It changed few minds at the top of the feeds, but it lingered with those who watched it in full. Amid these efforts, tensions occasionally snapped. A group of citizens organized a patrol that called itself the Neighborhood Guardians. They insisted they were acting in defense of property and safety, but their presence was polarizing. Some residents welcomed them, citing feelings of protection and agency. Others feared vigilantism and escalation. Complaints to authorities increased. The sheriff's office reiterated that citizens should not take action into their own hands and that any suspicious footage should be turned over to investigators. The warning was reasonable, but it did not erase the rawness of a community learning how to police itself in the age of viral suspicion. The phrase that had seeded fear and attention persisted, appearing in comments, in graffiti on a utility box, and then offhanded jokes that masked underlying dread. Some tried to erase it by rewriting it into calls for nonviolence. Others used it as a shorthand for the moment's hysteria. The line had become a cultural artifact, a tiny, ugly reminder of how quickly a town's discourse can shift from civic duty to punitive zeal. As public attention stretched thin, some advocates argued that the real story was not the viral clip at all, but the long-term neglect of the systems that had made the clip possible. They pressed for budget reallocation, independent oversight, and community engagement in corrections oversight. Whether these proposals would be adopted was uncertain, but structural change requires sustained attention, and the internet's appetite for outrage is capricious. Chapter 6. Months into the scandal, the town began to look less like a hotbed of panic and more like a place working through the consequences of having been seen. The viral clip's heat had diminished, trending charts showed a steady decline in engagement, yet the social and institutional aftershocks continued to reverberate. Lawsuits moved through courts, oversight committees convened, and funding debates returned to council agendas with a new urgency. The novelty of spectacle faded, replaced by the attrition of slow policy work. The Independent Oversight Committee convened for the first time in a well-attended public session. Its mandate was narrow but consequential: recommend a set of reforms to prevent future security failures, and propose transparency measures that balanced public interest with privacy concerns. The committee's membership, composed of community leaders, legal experts, and a representative from the State Corrections Department, deliberated publicly and, crucially, documented their decision process. For residents who feared unchecked authority, the transparency was a salve. For those who wanted quick justice, the committee's careful pace was a frustration. One of the committee's central recommendations was to digitize and maintain an immutable log of movements within the auxiliary facility, secured with redundancy and public oversight. The proposal promised to make it harder for records to be altered retroactively and easier for investigators to track actions without relying solely on fallible memory or incomplete paper logs. The technical fix was not glamorous, but it addressed one of the practical vulnerabilities that the viral clip had exposed. Civil society initiatives began to scale. The media literacy programs expanded into school curriculum, and the coalition of local journalists agreed to a voluntary code of conduct around reporting violent or incendiary content. The code, an unexpected turn, came when one of the women identified in the original clip eventually, cautiously, through verified channels, came forward with a carefully prepared statement. She did not speak in the immediate, explosive way that many had anticipated. Instead, she provided a measured account, asserting that the night in question had been part of a protest action intended to expose conditions inside the facility, a demonstration which, in their telling, had gone farther than intended. Whether this was the whole truth or one version of it, it shifted the narrative from anonymous silhouettes to human actors with motives. The revelation did not resolve everything. There were still legal implications and unresolved tensions about methods. But criminal justice does not always deliver moral neatness. It offers processes for weighing responsibility. The town's cultural conversation evolved. The mural near the municipal courthouse became a community touchstone, no longer merely an art piece, but a reminder that images can both harm and heal depending on how they are produced and circulated. Schools continued media literacy programs, and local content creators slowly adapted to a landscape where reckless sensationalism might carry legal repercussions. Some creators pivoted to in-depth reporting and collaborated with local journalists, trading quick hits for credibility. Still, the temptation towards simpler narratives remained. In online forums, the original phrase, "Stop them, otherwise I will shoot you," persisted as a shorthand for the moment's moral panic. It was used sarcastically and seriously, and sometimes to intimidate. A few isolated incidents of threats and harassment prompted law enforcement to intervene. Such incidents reminded the town that words can be weapons and that the spectacle's afterlife could include real-world danger. As reform initiatives took root, a few concrete changes offered hope. The auxiliary facility's maintenance schedule was updated, new security lighting and camera realignment were funded, and training for record-keeping was mandated. The sheriff's office adopted clear channels for public updates, attempting to be responsive without fueling rumor. Restoration projects, both practical and social, moved forward in fits and starts. By late in this chapter, the town's attention had thinned but not disappeared. The viral clip remained the reference point in civic conversations about transparency, accountability, and the ethics of mediated outrage. The episode had left scars and lessons. It had exposed how quickly community dynamics could be weaponized and how fragile reputations had become under the glare of virality. The question that lingered as this chapter drew to a close was not whether the Black Lady Gang had intended harm or spectacle. It was whether the town would use the crisis to build infrastructure that made future reckonings more just and less prone to mob logic.
The answer, as yet, was mixed. Some systems had improved, some relationships had been healed, and some resentments lingered like graffiti, hard to remove, easy to reappear.
Chapter 7. The seventh chapter opened on a town that had been changed by attention, and had, in small ways, begun to change itself. The big, viral arc that had once consumed feeds now functioned as a reference point in policy discussions and school curricula. Tales of the clip were retold in cautious tones, case studies in ethics classes, cautionary references in council debates, and a chapter in the local library's oral history project. The spectacle had become a lesson, though not a neat one. By this stage, the auxiliary facility was no longer simply a site of scandal. It had become a locus of reform. The Oversight Committee's recommendations had been partially adopted. Maintenance logs were digitized, camera placements were audited, and a public review board was established with rotating community representation. The review board did not solve every problem, but it introduced procedures that made manipulation of records more difficult and public transparency more feasible. The reforms were not a panacea. Structural deficiencies in criminal justice persisted, but the town's institutions had been nudged to be better stewards of public trust. At the human level, the stories remained messy. Some of those involved in the original incident, those who had described it as protest, faced legal consequences. Some were offered restorative alternatives contingent on community service and participation in reconciliation programs. The town debated the merits of these outcomes with the same fervor it had debated the clip itself. Opinions split along lines of fairness and accountability. The nuances were unsatisfying for those who had hoped for the clean moral arcs that viral videos supply, but they reflected a more complex reality. Wrongdoing and grievance coexist, and resolution is rarely absolute. Creatively, the scandal generated new work. Local artists constructed a multimedia exhibit exploring the relationship between image, truth, and community. The exhibit juxtaposed original footage, edits, commentary, and personal testimonies to highlight how easily context could be lost or distorted. Visitors, media students, retirees, town officials walked through the installation with discomfort and understanding. The exhibit was not catharsis so much as a mirror. It forced the community to look at itself, and that process yielded awkward insights about culpability and complicity. Legal proceedings wound down with settlements, court-ordered apologies, and in a few cases, convictions for property damage and trespass. The courtroom drama that the internet had predicted dissolved into legal technicalities and negotiated outcomes. Those who had once demanded theatrical justice found the system's pace infuriating. Others breathed easier, relieved that due process had not been entirely replaced by online verdicts. The slow rhythm of law reasserted itself, insisting on evidence and precedent over instant moral clarity. The phrase that had once galvanized fear, "Stop them, otherwise I will shoot you," surfaced occasionally in graffiti and on late-night feeds, but its power diminished. Over time, it read less like a threat and more like a relic of a moment the town had outgrown. The word's stickiness was symptomatic of how digital culture commodifies outrage. Certain phrases become hooks that remain, even when their meaning has attenuated. The town had been scarred, but it had also built immunity of sorts, an institutional vaccine made of better records, clearer oversight, and community literacy. Some of the most poignant developments were not legal or policy-driven, but interpersonal. Families who had been harassed slowly reconnected with neighbors who had been swept up in rumor. Some relationships were irreparably broken. Trust, once lost, is fragile and often labile. Rebuilding took time, apologies, and public acknowledgement of harm. Where repair succeeded, it often did so because people chose to prioritize mutual obligations over instantaneous judgment. These were small, difficult acts that rarely make for viral content, but they were the essential labor of civic life. National conversations about platform responsibility and the viral spread of local harm picked up the story as a cautionary tale. Think pieces, policy briefs, and academic articles synthesized the sequence of events into lessons about moderation, legal accountability, and community resilience. The town's experience was cited in discussions about algorithmic incentives and the ethics of exposure. For the town itself, these conversations were double-edged. Recognition validated their hardship, but national interests also threatened to reopen wounds. Into this altered landscape, younger creators emerged who had learned from the scandal. They emphasized verification, humane storytelling, and partnerships with local journalists. Their channels grew, not because they courted outrage, but because audiences began to prefer careful investigation over sensationalism, at least in localized contexts where harm had real human consequences. The market for credibility, it turned out, was fertile ground. The closure that many had demanded, in the form of a single definitive answer, never fully arrived. The clip's origins remained partially obscured, its intentions disputed. Some participants admitted to acts of protest, others maintained that the footage had been staged or edited. The town had to live with ambiguity. What it did not have to live with, however, was the complacency that had allowed a flawed system to remain unexamined. For many residents, the experience galvanized the commitment to civic participation, monitoring budget proposals, attending oversight meetings, and volunteering for community support programs. There were, inevitably, tragedies and regrets. Some people who had been hounded online moved away. Some businesses closed, casualties of a reputation economy that punishes association even when guilt is unproven. These losses were part of the story the viral clips had not planned for. They served as a caution about the real-world consequences of virtual fervor. In the end, the town's story became less about a gang and more about the ways communities process fear in the digital age. It was about how a single clip could expand and contract through platforms, legal systems, and human relationships, amplifying grievances and testing institutions. It was about the necessity of slow work, policy, education, and restorative practice in the face of a culture organized around immediacy. The last frames of this narrative were not cinematic. They were procedural. Council meetings, volunteer training, a new public oversight portal online, a mural that locals touch with reverence and regret. The town had survived the spectacle and had chosen, imperfectly, to repair itself. It had learned that virality could not be the only arbiter of truth, and that the cost of outrage was measured not only in clicks, but in lives disrupted. As the final lights dimmed on the controversy, people returned to familiar rhythms, school runs, small businesses, municipal budgets, carrying with them a heightened awareness of how easily a story can be made and a responsibility to be more careful about the stories they spread. The viral clip would live on in archives and in teaching modules, a case study in the messy interface between image and accountability. The town had not been saved by spectacle. It had been nudged, slowly and unevenly, toward work that might make future scandals less likely and less damaging.
In a quiet town where power, pride, and revenge rule the streets, a secretive group known as the Black Lady Gang is about to ignite chaos no one saw coming. When betrayal meets desperation behind the cold bars of a jail cell, the line between justice and survival blurs. This is the Black Lady Gang Break the Jail Bar, Stop Them, Otherwise I Will Shoot You. As the smoke clears and the truth unfolds, one question remains. Was it justice? Or just another game of power gone too far? Stay tuned for more twisted tales of betrayal, revenge, and survival. Until next time, remember, trust no one.